Me as a person, I will never stop looking, ever. You drive down the road, you are constantly looking.
But we begin tonight with another major breaking story. Nearly 15 years after 3 young brothers vanished, their father is now charged with murder.
It was Thanksgiving 2010, but for 3 young boys, it was the beginning of a disturbing mystery. Andrew, 9, Alexander, 7, and Tanner, just 5 years old, spent the afternoon playing in their father's backyard in Morenci, Michigan. But by the next morning, those boys were gone. Just like that, without a trace or signs or clues. No one had seen them leave, and the only person who seemed to know where they were was their father, John Skelton. And yet, he refused to say a word. For 15 long years, John stuck to a story that no one believed, that his sons were taken by a mysterious underground group, one that he claimed had been protecting them from their mother. A story that changed over time, unraveling more questions with each new version. But what really happened that night in Morenci? The answer, as it turns out, is far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of the Skelton brothers, a disappearance that haunted an entire town. As we unravel the events piece by piece, we'll attempt to answer the question that has tortured a mother and shaken the world for over a decade. What really happened to the Skelton boys? But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Before the boys disappeared, the Skelton family seemed, on the surface, like any other family struggling through the ups and downs of life. John Skelton, a former long-haul truck driver, had always been a quiet, hard-working man, and his wife, Tanya Zuvers, was a devoted mother to their 3 sons, Andrew, 9, Alexander, 7, and Tanner, just 5. Despite the challenges they faced in their marriage, the boys were the heart of their world, and both John and Tanya loved them deeply, but behind closed doors, things were far from perfect. Their marriage had always been strained, with John's long hours on the road and Tanya's deepening concerns about his behavior. However, it was in September 2010 that the cracks in their relationship became undeniable. Tanya made the difficult decision to file for divorce. It was a move that would change everything. John, who had always been stubborn and controlling, didn't take the separation well. And instead of working through the process amicably, he began to act out in more extreme ways. John's behavior escalated, and by the time October rolled around, he was pushing hard to get Tanya and the children to move with him to Florida, despite knowing Tanya had no interest in relocating. He was already unemployed. His drunk driving conviction the previous year had cost him his job, and he had nothing left to hold on to, but he couldn't see that. His fixation on getting the family to Florida, without Tanya's consent, showed just how deep his obsession with control had become. Then, one fateful day in October, John took the boys out of school under the pretense of a family trip to Florida, without informing Tanya. She was blindsided when the school called to say the children had been picked up. She tried reaching John, but he was unreachable, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When John finally answered, he assured her everything was fine. But by then, Tanya knew she had to act quickly. She contacted an attorney, and by September 13, 2010, she had taken legal steps to gain emergency custody of their sons, desperate to prevent John from taking them away for good. The judge granted Tanya emergency custody, but it was clear John was becoming more unpredictable by the day. John, however, had a different perspective. He began to claim that Tanya was and emotionally abusing children, even alleging that the boys had told him that Tanya was them. This was a shocking and serious accusation, one that would paint Tanya in a dark light. John claimed that his decision to take the children away was an act of protection, a desperate move to shield them from harm. His accusations were deeply rooted in the fact that Tanya had a criminal history from 1998, when she was convicted of 4th-degree criminal conduct involving a teenage boy. Tanya, having served her sentence and moved on with her life, had been cleared in the family court proceedings, with no evidence of any current risk to her children. Nonetheless, John held on to this narrative, insisting that Tanya's past justified his actions. However, as investigators delved deeper, they found that John's claims were false. Law enforcement had already reviewed Tanya's criminal record and had investigated the allegations against her. There was no evidence to support John's accusations, and all three judges who had overseen the custody battle had granted Tanya full custody of the children, despite her past. Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 2010, was supposed to be a time of togetherness, a chance to put aside the tensions of the past year and enjoy family. John Skelton had the boys for the holiday, as agreed in the midst of the ongoing custody battle with his wife, Tanya Zuvers. Despite the strain in their relationship, Tanya had agreed to let John spend Thanksgiving with Andrew, 9, Alexander, 7, and Tanner, 5, hoping it might ease the growing custody tensions between them. But little did she know that decision would mark the last time she would ever see her sons alive. That afternoon, the boys were last seen playing outside in John's backyard. But as the day wore on, things began to take a darker turn. John had promised Tanya that he would return the boys by 5 p.m., the agreed-upon time. Yet, when that time passed, Tanya still hadn't heard from him. The minutes turned into hours, and John's phone went silent. Tanya called him over and over again, each time more desperate than the last. She left messages, hoping for an explanation, but no response. What had happened to her sons? Why hadn't John returned them? She paced around her house, unsure of what to do, but she had no idea how serious things had become. But what Tanya didn't know at that moment was that John had posted something strange on Facebook just hours before, a message that seemed almost like a quiet admission of something evil. May God and Tanya forgive me. The next day, November 27, 2010, Tanya woke up with a sense of dread that only deepened as the hours passed. It had been more than 12 hours since John was supposed to return the boys. Tanya, desperate to get answers, made her way to John's house to pick up the boys. But when she arrived, the house was locked, and there was no sign of life. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. Worry turned to panic as she realized the worst possible scenario was unfolding before her. She immediately called the police. When officers arrived and gained entry into the house, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for years to come. The house was in complete disarray, furniture overturned, shattered plates and broken objects scattered across the floor. The disarray inside was more than just a mess. It was as if a violent struggle had taken place. As the investigation began to unfold, John was located not at home, but in a hospital in Toledo, Ohio. He claimed that he had broken his ankle during an attempt. He told doctors he had tried to end his life by hanging himself, but his attempt had failed, and he fell, injuring his ankle in the process. On the surface, this seemed like an explanation, but there were too many inconsistencies for anyone to take John's version of events at face value. Why was he alone in Ohio? Why hadn't he returned the boys? His story seemed more like an attempt to gain sympathy or cover his tracks rather than a genuine cry for help. Something didn't add up. Back at John's house, as officers continued their investigation, they made a discovery that would change everything. A rope tied to a banister was found on the second floor of the house. And as if this wasn't enough, investigators found a 3-page letter addressed to Tanya. He wrote, "You'll hate me forever. I guess this is my final goodbye." The words seemed like a confession, a final plea for understanding, but they were also disturbing. John's story began to unravel almost as soon as the police started questioning him. Initially, he claimed that he had given the boys to a friend, a woman he named Joanne Taylor. According to John, Joanne was someone he had met online and trusted to take care of his children. But when the authorities dug into this claim, they found something unsettling. Joanne Taylor didn't exist. There were no records of her, no trace of any interaction between her and John, and no corroborating evidence to support his story. The more they investigated, the clearer it became that John's initial explanation was nothing but a fabrication.
A frantic search in the town of Morenci. The father, 39-year-old John Skelton, claims he gave them to a woman he met over the internet before trying to take his own life. He gave the name Joanne Taylor.
Up to this point, we have not been able to locate a Joanne Taylor or confirm that she...
Then John shifted his story yet again, this time introducing a new, even more bizarre theory. He claimed that the boys had been taken by an underground group, a clandestine organization dedicated to protecting children from abusive parents. This group, according to John, was called United Foster Outreach and Underground Sanctuaries, and it was supposedly run by a network of individuals who helped children escape dangerous homes. It sounded almost like a poorly thought-out excuse, but John seemed adamant. He insisted that the boys were safe, hidden away by this group, and that they would never be returned to Tanya, who he still insisted was a threat to their well-being. The problem was, there was no evidence to support John's claims. Investigators found no trace of any such organization existing anywhere. No one had ever heard of United Foster Outreach, and John's description of it seemed to grow more absurd with every retelling. To make matters more bizarre, John mentioned Mo Gingrich, a former Amish man who had no ties to the case. When authorities reached out to Mo, he denied even knowing John, let alone being involved in any underground child protection network. It quickly became clear that this was another desperate attempt by John to shift the blame and avoid any suspicion falling on him.
Skelton says he gave his sons, only 5, 7, and 9 years old, to an organization to protect them from his estranged wife, Tanya. Police have not accused her of any wrongdoing. Skelton now says he has doubts about the alleged group he gave his kids to.
I could have just been duped. They could have just scammed me and took my kids. I don't know.
As Action News first reported months ago, police found ropes and at least one noose in John's home when they searched it. John says none of what was seized in the home proves he hurt his sons. Your family released the search warrant return from your home the day that the boys were declared missing. And in that search warrant, it said that there was ropes and a noose found in your house, along with a lot of bleach and cleaning products. What exactly were those products for, and why was there a noose in your house?
Bleach and cleaning products. I don't know.
You have 3 minutes.
It was laundry soap in the bathroom. That's it.
You're saying you did not hurt the kids with that noose?
I didn't. They never even saw that.
Okay, and
They
you
never saw it at all.
did you say that was for a project?
Yes.
Can you describe the project at all?
No. Not right now because of the investigation. The ropes were for a cradle harness. I guess that's what you call it. So I was making a harness to go around my waist and legs, like a rope climbing.
Also, according to the search warrant return, a bullet was found on a stair inside John's home. Skelton says it was part of an old gun collection, which is long gone.
I had them since I lived.
As investigators pushed harder, they discovered a disturbing pattern in John's behavior. His internet searches revealed a chilling preoccupation with methods of harm. Among the search history, investigators found queries like how to break a neck and can rat poison kill a person? These were not the searches of someone trying to help his children escape from a dangerous home. They were the searches of someone who was considering how to hurt them.
The family and investigators left with puzzling questions.
Why would he not come to the family? You know, if you need to take the children somewhere, why take them to somebody else?
Kathy Herrera, spokesperson for the mother Tanya Skelton, seen here with her boys, 9-year-old Andrew, 7-year-old Alexander, and 5-year-old Tanner. The separated couple spent Thanksgiving together with the boys. John Skelton rushed to an Ohio hospital Friday afternoon after a failed suicide attempt. An Amber Alert issued for the 3 boys later that day. This chilling post left on his Facebook page Wednesday.
It says, "I love my wife very much. May God and Tanya forgive me."
Police searching the family home and taking the father's minivan as evidence last night. A K-9 unit searching the ground in nearby areas. A helicopter with thermal imaging technology scanning above. Police also searching the web for any clue that could lead them to these missing little boys.
We have computer forensic investigators that are working on many aspects.
By February 2011, the investigation into the disappearance of Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton had taken a dark turn. What had started as a missing persons case, one filled with hope that the boys might still be alive, was now officially classified as a homicide investigation. Authorities were no longer convinced the boys were alive. The search for them had stretched on for months, but with each passing day, the likelihood of a happy resolution grew slimmer. However, The investigation soon focused on a key piece of evidence, John's cell phone records. The records showed a significant clue that would prove pivotal in the case. John's phone was tracked leaving Morenci, where he had lived with his family, and traveling south into Ohio in the early hours of November 26, 2010, the day after Thanksgiving. The phone was tracked to a location approximately 20 miles away from Morenci, and then it went offline for a period of time. Investigators believed that this brief but significant trip was when John disposed of the bodies. It seemed clear that during this window of time, John had been alone with the boys, and it was during these crucial hours that he likely took their lives and hid their remains. At a court hearing in early 2011, John was presented with the evidence against him, but he remained defiant. The judge, frustrated with his lack of cooperation, found him in contempt of court for refusing to provide any information about his sons.
Are you prepared to make the children immediately available to Mrs. Skelton?
I have no way of doing that.
Tanya Skelton also took the stand and recounted that fateful day of her boy's disappearance. Then the judge asked again.
So is it your position you are not able to comply with the court order, or that you are unwilling to comply with the order?
Unable.
John Skelton faces parental kidnapping charges and now has a contempt of court charge hanging over his head in that custody case. Now Tanya Skelton has full custody of her 3 sons that she's not seen since before Thanksgiving.
As a result, John was held without bail, a clear indication that the legal system had already determined he was no longer a man being questioned about a missing persons case. And by September 2011, he pleaded no contest to the charges of unlawful imprisonment in connection with the disappearance of his 3 sons. It was a decision that many saw as an attempt to avoid a more severe sentence, or perhaps to shield himself from facing even more serious charges. However, despite the no contest plea, the more serious charges of kidnapping were dropped. John's sentence was set at 10 to 15 years in prison, the maximum allowed for the unlawful imprisonment conviction.
Today marks the 8-year anniversary of the day the Skelton brothers vanished. We've been following their case from the very beginning. And now, in the most surprising twist yet, you're about to hear what their grandfather is saying about their mysterious disappearance.
This past summer, John Skelton Sr., his wife Roxanne, and daughter Lucinda went to visit John in prison. After that visit, they said they would never go back. Skelton says he feels John isn't sharing everything he knows.
He's hiding information. Well, I'm not going to say he's not telling the truth, but I think he's telling the truth. But the truth, the whole story of things concerned, he's hiding.
This is much different than what we heard from Skelton Sr. back when we visited the family at their home in Jacksonville in October of last year.
I don't care how drastic things could have gotten in his mind. He would have not hurt the boys.
They were things, bits and pieces I'd heard in the past, but when you sit back and objectively look at what he is saying and some of these other pieces that happened that were is willing to do what I think is going to have to be done on this whole situation, then I will be there with the state officials, and we will sit down as a conference and go from there.
There's no one out there that really believes his story truly. Does that help me? Absolutely, because it does kind of back him into a corner. At the end of the day, this case is very simple. John was their dad. He was with them the night that they went missing. And whatever we can do for him to make him feel comfortable enough to trust us, I'm willing to do.
Then in 2017, a glimmer of hope emerged, albeit one that would soon be shattered. A cleaning crew in Missoula, Montana made a startling discovery when they found bone fragments inside a shed. The fragments seemed to match the ages of the missing Skelton boys, and for a brief moment, the possibility that the boys might have been found alive, or at least their remains, seemed within reach. But the hope was short-lived. Forensic tests were quickly conducted, and the results revealed something that would dash any remaining hopes. The bones were over 100 years old, completely unrelated to the Skelton brothers. Then, in 2019, a new lead came in that sent investigators back to Ohio. The tip claimed that a witness had seen John's van parked near a pond in the area on Thanksgiving Day 2010, just hours before the boys went missing. The idea that the van was close to the location where they believed John had been during the early hours of November 26th made the tip seem credible, or at least worth investigating. Authorities quickly mobilized and returned to the area, conducting a thorough search of the pond and surrounding land, hoping to find something that could finally bring them closer to the truth. But once again, the search yielded nothing. There was no sign of the boys, no trace of their whereabouts, and no fresh evidence to explain their disappearance. As the investigation continued, the more John's shifting stories began to fuel the public's curiosity, with various theories emerging, each trying to explain what had happened to Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton. The first theory that gained traction was John's claim that the boys had been taken by an underground group, as earlier mentioned. As time went on, the murder theory gained traction, and it became the leading explanation among law enforcement officials and investigators. The evidence overwhelmingly pointed toward one conclusion: John Skelton had murdered his sons. Investigators believed that John unalived the boys sometime between Thanksgiving afternoon and the early morning hours of November 26, 2010, in a calculated act of revenge against Tanya. The motive, according to many, was to punish Tanya for winning custody of the boys and for ending their marriage. There were, however, other theories that surfaced over the years, though they were largely based on speculation. One of these was the trafficking theory, which suggested that the boys had been taken by human traffickers. Some believed that John had handed them off to a dangerous network, either in a misguided attempt to protect them or out of desperation. This theory gained some attention, especially in online forums and true crime circles, where people speculated that John might have unknowingly connected with traffickers. However, investigators found no leads linking John to any trafficking rings, and his phone and computer records showed no communication with any known predators or criminals. No suspicious financial transactions or records of such dealings ever surfaced. It seemed clear that while the idea of trafficking was a gripping narrative, it simply didn't align with the facts of the case. Another variation of the theory that gained some ground was the off-grid theory. Some speculated that the boys might have been hidden away by a secluded community, perhaps an Amish or Mennonite group, or even relocated abroad. This theory was grounded in the idea that John, in his increasingly disturbed state, might have placed the boys with a group that lived off the grid, where they would be beyond the reach of the law. But again, no evidence ever emerged to substantiate this theory. Investigators conducted thorough searches in Amish communities and checked with known off-grid groups, but found no trace of the boys. In the end, the murder theory stood as the most credible and widely accepted explanation, supported by the circumstantial evidence, John's actions, and his inconsistent statements. However, in November 2025, nearly 15 years after the Skelton brothers vanished, a significant development in the case emerged, bringing renewed attention to an investigation that had long gone cold. John Skelton, the boys' father, was charged with 3 counts of open murder and 3 counts of tampering with evidence, marking a critical shift in a case that had baffled investigators and devastated a family for over a decade. John had already been serving a 10 to 15-year sentence for unlawful imprisonment after pleading no contest to that charge in 2011, and he was set to be released from prison in November 2025. But this new round of charges changed everything. Instead of being freed, John now faced the possibility of life in prison, as the evidence against him had been reevaluated in light of new findings. Investigators now asserted that John Skelton killed his sons, a claim they had previously suspected but could not prove. The boys' bodies had never been found, but the new charges suggested that John had disposed of their bodies during that critical window when his phone pinged in Ohio on the night of their disappearance. The charges marked a turning point in the case, bringing new hope for Tanya Zuvers, the boys' mother, and others who had long been seeking justice for Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. For 15 years, they had been haunted by the uncertainty of their fates, waiting for the day when the truth would finally be revealed. This new legal development offered a chance for closure, and it seemed that justice might finally be within reach. And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Which of the theories are you for? What do you think really happened to these kids? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Willem van Eyck was locked away behind bars where he would never hurt anyone again, but his time in prison didn't reform him. It only strengthened the monster within, and after serving his time, he was released, and that's when the true horror began. Out of custody, free to roam once again, Willem's killing spree resumed with terrifying brutality. His quiet return to society wasn't marked by remorse or change, but was marked by an escalation in his violence, a desire for control that grew stronger with every victim he claimed. But how did someone who had already shown the world his true nature, someone who had been caught, locked away, and then released, manage to slip through the cracks once more? How did a man like Willem van Eyck manage to hide in plain sight for years, committing unspeakable acts without anyone noticing? The terrifying truth behind Willem van Eyck, the Beast of Harkstede, is a story of failed justice, missed warnings, and the disturbing consequences of underestimating a monster. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Willem van Eyck was born on August 13, 1941, in the small, quiet village of Korteraar, nestled in South Holland. It was during the dark days of World War II, when the Netherlands was under German occupation, that he came into the world. He was the 6th of 8 children, born into a working-class family. As a child, Willem was quickly branded an outsider, and school was a battlefield for him, a place where he was relentlessly bullied. The other children called him Gekke Willempie, meaning crazy little Willem, a nickname that would stick with him through his childhood like a cruel reminder of his isolation. But it wasn't just the other children who contributed to his misery, but Willem's family, especially his mother. Adriana also played a significant role in the formation of his psychological state. After the death of Willem's younger sister, who tragically passed away at the age of 2, Adriana's grief drove her to take actions that would further harm Willem's fragile sense of self. In an attempt to cope with the loss, she began dressing Willem in his sister's clothes, forcing him to assume an identity that wasn't his. His brothers described him as evil personified, even at such a young age, and while this description might seem extreme, it wasn't too far off when considering the severity of his actions towards animals. By the time Willem reached his teenage years, the signs of his morbid behavior were undeniable. He started collecting dead insects and dried frogs, things that most children wouldn't even think to touch, but to him, they were objects of fascination. His cruelty to animals was the next step in his growing detachment from the world around him. He enjoyed torturing animals and finding pleasure in their suffering. He would even drown cats and kick ducks until they died, actions so disturbing that even his brothers could not ignore them. However, instead of being confronted or corrected, these behaviors were dismissed as just part of who he was. To the people around him, he was just Gekke Willempie, the odd boy with a strange habit. But in reality, he was already developing the mindset of a predator, someone who found pleasure in the suffering of the weak and defenseless. As he grew older, Willem's psychological state worsened, and his actions became increasingly alarming. School remained a struggle. He had trouble learning and struggled with language, which only pushed him further into isolation. He couldn't connect with his peers, and as time went on, his frustration turned inward, manifesting in petty crimes. Willem stole from his family, then from his neighbors and the other people in his village. His devastating lack of social connection led him to retreat into a world of fantasy, a world where he could finally control the one thing that had always eluded him: women. These fantasies began to darken as he dreamt of and unaliving women. He thought about it constantly, consumed by the idea that he could dominate, possess, and destroy. These thoughts, twisted and monstrous, would eventually push him to commit his first crime. It was June 20th, 1971, when Cora Montel, just 15 years old, began her journey home after spending the evening with her boyfriend in Amsterdam. But when Cora and her boyfriend reached the bus stop to head home, they discovered the last bus of the evening had already left. It wasn't the first time Cora had found herself in this situation, and as she had done before, she decided to hitchhike back to her village in Youthhorn, a journey that would seem harmless to her. It was just a few miles after all, and she had made the trip before without incident. But this time would be different. Willem van Eyck was out that night, drinking beers in a local cafe in Amsterdam when he saw Cora. For him, it was a moment of opportunity, one he had been waiting for. He had been following his dark fantasies for some time, and when he saw Cora standing alone by the side of the road, everything in him was screaming to go for it. So Willem pulled his car over and offered Cora a ride. She accepted, unaware of the danger that was already looming over her. She had no reason to suspect him. He seemed like any other stranger offering a lift, and for a moment, everything felt normal. But as the car sped along the quiet road, Willem's true intentions slowly came into focus. He wasn't just giving her a ride, he was planning to kill her. He then took a detour, far from the route she had expected, and when they reached a quiet, isolated spot, he stopped the car and told her, "Let's say goodbye to each other." When she tried to escape, he forced her back into the car, and the moment he touched her, he was consumed by his fantasy. At that moment, he knew he wasn't going to let her walk away. He strangled her with her own scarf, a symbol of the control he desperately sought over her life, and as he did, he later confessed, his emotions were conflicted regret, but also a strange satisfaction. The victim, Cora, had only lived a short time, he said, and yet, in that moment, he finally had control. He then raped her, his coldness towards her becoming more apparent as he described the act in stark detail. Once her life had been extinguished, he discarded her body as if it were nothing more than trash. He then left her naked in a ditch. Cora Mantell's life ended that night, and her body was left to be discovered the next morning. Her body was found on June 21st, 1971, not far from where she had been dropped off, and the discovery sent shockwaves through the village, and the authorities immediately launched an investigation. For hours, no one could identify the victim. It wasn't until a watch repair mark on her wristwatch was recognized that her identity was confirmed. But even then, the investigation stalled. The police had no leads, and the public was left in a state of disbelief. How could this have happened? How could a young girl, simply returning home after seeing her boyfriend, be killed in such a brutal way? People couldn't fathom the depth of the darkness that had emerged in their peaceful town. And yet, in the midst of this horror, no one realized that the man responsible had already been in the crowd, hiding in plain sight, and was now one step closer to repeating his crimes. It was August 19, 1974, when Altje van der Plaat, a 43-year-old nurse from Groningen, decided to take a walk after attending church with her family. Altje had always enjoyed her solitary walks, a brief moment of peace in her busy life, and she had no reason to suspect that this quiet evening would be her last. As she wandered near the canal, near the small houseboat of a man she didn't know, fate took a terrible turn. Willem was in the area as he often was, but this time, something was different. When he saw Altje, an idea formed in his mind, an idea he couldn't resist. She was alone, unsuspecting, and walking right past his houseboat. It was an opportunity he had been waiting for. In the blink of an eye, he grabbed a knife and jumped onto his moped, quickly following her. Altje was startled, but trying to remain calm. She had no idea that the man chasing her had murder in his heart. When Willem reached her, he attacked without warning, her several times, but he didn't stop there. Willem, lost in his frenzy, cut open her stomach, the violence escalating beyond anything he had ever imagined. But the brutality didn't end with her death. He her left nipple, a gesture that would come to symbolize the complete dehumanization of his victims. As the attack unfolded, several witnesses saw Van Eyck in the area, driving his moped near the canal, and immediately suspected him. It wasn't long before police began to piece together the clues. They were able to trace his movements to the area around the time of Altje's murder. The witnesses' accounts, along with his history, led investigators straight to him, and Willem was arrested the following day. The interrogation was intense. Van Eyck, known for his ability to stay calm under pressure, eventually cracked under the weight of the evidence. He admitted to killing Altje, but he didn't stop there. He also confessed to the murder of Cora Mantell, the first victim, whose death he had managed to avoid being linked to for so long. His cold, emotionless confession sent shivers down the spines of everyone in the room. This was not the behavior of a remorseful man. It was the behavior of a predator who had no guilt, only a desire to justify his actions. He spoke as though he were recounting the events of a casual conversation, completely detached from the horrific reality of what he had done. His trial followed in 1975, and the gruesome details of Willem's crimes were revealed in court. Witnesses, psychiatrists, and law enforcement testified about his coldness and the emotional emptiness behind his actions. But what was perhaps most chilling was the fact that he had already confessed to 2 murders, and there were likely more victims whose names hadn't even been uncovered yet. In the end, Willem van Eyck was convicted of the murders of both Cora Mantell and Altje van der Plaat. The court handed down an 18-year sentence alongside mandatory psychiatric treatment. Willem van Eyck's arrest marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would see him confined to a prison cell, facing the consequences of his brutal actions. But while behind bars, a new battle unfolded, one that had less to do with the law and more to do with his mind. Psychiatric evaluations were ordered as part of his sentence, and the results painted a disturbing picture of the man behind the crimes. Diagnosed with narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders, Willem was seen as a dangerous individual, driven not by remorse or empathy, but by a deep-seated desire for control and power. The psychiatrists who assessed him struggled to understand the depths of his detachment from reality. His resistance to treatment was immediate and profound. Willem didn't just refuse to engage with the therapy, he outright rejected any attempt to address his psychological issues. Willem's own words would later reveal that he believed engaging with therapy would lead to a psychic breakdown, a loss of control over his mind that he wasn't willing to risk. So, he fought it, resisted every effort, and maintained an air of calm detachment, as though the system couldn't touch him. But in truth, his behavior only grew worse. His violent tendencies, which had been buried beneath the surface for so long, began to surface once again. The Van Mesdag Clinic, known for dealing with the most dangerous of patients, found themselves struggling to manage him. He had become one of the clinic's hardest cases, often finding himself placed in solitary confinement due to his combative nature. He was not a man looking for help. He was a man who saw himself as untouchable. Yet, amidst the bleakness of his confinement, a surprising development occurred. In the midst of his isolation, Willem found connection in the most unlikely of places. He began to correspond with a woman named Audrey, a widow already with 5 children, who was initially just a pen pal. Audrey had read about Willem, and something in his story compelled her to write to him. What followed was a series of letters that would lead to an unexpected relationship. Through the written word, they grew closer, with Audrey learning more about Willem's past and, in her own way, offering him a glimmer of hope, or at least the idea of a future beyond the prison walls. Despite knowing the horrific details of his crimes, Audrey still chose to believe that he could change, and in 1981, after years of correspondence, they became engaged. And by 1982, while still behind bars, Willem and Audrey were married. It was a bizarre turn of events. A man who had committed heinous acts now had a wife who was fully aware of his past. But for Willem, the marriage was a form of social rehabilitation in the eyes of his doctors, a way to prove that he was capable of normalcy, even if the reality was far from it. But the marriage did not change the core of Willem's being. His mind was still plagued by violent fantasies, and a deep-seated need for control remained unaddressed. And yet, in 1990, despite everything, Willem was released from prison. The decision to release him came from a psychiatric assessment that concluded he had changed, or at least that he was ready to be reintegrated into society. Psychiatrists believed that the bond he shared with Audrey could act as a preventive measure, keeping his impulses in check. They believed he was ready to function in society again, despite the glaring absence of treatment for his trauma and the untreated psychological wounds that had been festering for years. They even felt that his past behaviors could be controlled with the right monitoring, but that was a dangerous assumption, one that would soon be proven wrong. After his release, Willem van Eyck and his wife, Audrey, moved to a house in the quiet village of Harkstede, hoping to start fresh, to leave behind the dark past that had consumed his earlier years. As time went on, cracks began to appear in their relationship. Willem's impulses never fully disappeared. He began drinking more frequently, and soon his behavior turned darker once again. He young women, some of whom were interns at the animal ambulance where Audrey worked, but despite these warning signs, Audrey either ignored or dismissed them, choosing to focus on the love they had built. But the reality of his nature would soon catch up with him. By 1993, just a few years after his release, Willem would commit his first confirmed post-prison murder. Michelle Fatal, a 23-year-old prostitute, became his first victim in this new chapter of violence. On that day, Willem encountered Michelle while she was working in the street-walking area near Enumatal, a quiet village not far from his home in Harkstede. He picked her up in his car, a familiar ritual, and the two drove to a secluded spot, and there, during a sexual encounter, Willem her with his bare hands. Then he left her body in a ditch, discarded as though she was nothing more than a nuisance. The act was cold and calculated, as though it had been a long-awaited release for Willem, who had spent years under confinement, holding back the violence that had festered inside him. The murder of Michelle marked the beginning of a series of similar killings. In 1995, just 2 years later, another woman became his target. Annelies Reinders, a 31-year-old street worker from Harlingen. Annelies, like Michelle, was vulnerable, alone, and unaware of the threat that lay in wait. Willem picked her up and also took her to a secluded spot. There, the violence mirrored that of his previous crime, and once again, the victim's life was taken without remorse. But the police had little to go on in both Michelle and Annelies' cases, but the similarities between the two murders were hard to ignore. And Willem's signature was beginning to reveal itself, but no one had connected the dots yet. However, Audrey was completely unaware of this, but she knew Willem had behavioral issues which she has been ignoring. The breaking point came in 1998. After a violent argument, Willem physically assaulted Audrey, and for the first time, she realized that there was no hope for change. The man she had married, the man she had hoped would become a partner, was not capable of the normalcy she had once believed in. So, Audrey left him, supported by her children, who helped her find a place away from him. For Willem, this loss was devastating. That was the only person who had ever been close to him, the only person who had believed in him and now was gone. This loss, however, would become a trigger for him. His deep resentment toward women, especially those who rejected him, began to boil over once again. So, he began to reach out to street workers, inviting them to his home, and with his driver's license revoked due to his excessive drinking, he could no longer pick women up from the street, so he would call them directly, luring them to his farm. The third victim would prove to be the one that would finally tie Willem's past and present together. Sascha Schenker, a 34-year-old prostitute, went missing in 2001 after visiting Van Eyck's house. She had been a regular visitor to his farm, a familiar face who was often there at his request. However, on July 17, 2001, Sascha's body was found in the Sloterdijk Canal near Harkstede, and her clothes were discovered months later, not far from Willem's house, but in a plastic bag weighted with stones. The discovery of her clothing, so close to his home, made Willem the prime suspect in her disappearance, and the police began to connect the dots between the other women who had gone missing in the area. Sascha's murder was the break the authorities had been waiting for, the discovery that would lead them to Willem van Eyck. As the investigation progressed, the police made the connection between the victim's clothing and Willem's house, and the links began to pile up. They also discovered that Willem used a very specific type of rope, the same kind he used for fishing traps, and that this same rope had been used in at least one of the murders. These pieces of evidence, when put together, created an undeniable trail leading straight to Willem, and he was arrested on November 12, 2001, after the authorities had gathered enough evidence, and during his interrogation, Willem confessed to the murders of Michelle Fatal, Annelies Reinders, and Sascha Schenker. And as the investigation into Willem van Eyck's confirmed murders drew to a close, questions remained. Despite the confession, there were lingering doubts about whether van Eyck was responsible for other unsolved deaths. 3 names stood out among the many unsolved cases: Antoinette Bon, Shirley Hereigers, and Yolanda Meyer. These women were all prostitutes working in the same area and had disappeared under circumstances eerily similar to those of Van Eyck's confirmed victims. The case of Antoinette Bon was particularly devastating. In 1995, her torso was found in the Winschoterdiep, a canal not far from Harkstede. The rest of her body parts were discovered in a sports bag, but her head never recovered, and coupled with the fact that she had been a street worker, made investigators consider the possibility that Van Eyck was involved. Then in 1997, another woman, Shirley Hereigers, was found dead in Groningen. Her cause of death was later confirmed to be strangulation, and a scarf with her blood was found in Van Eyck's home. This piece of evidence was hard to ignore, especially given the patterns of his other killings. The case of Yolanda Meyer, who went missing in 1998, also raised suspicions. She was last seen around the same time Van Eyck's violent tendencies were resurfacing, and some witnesses even claimed that Yolanda had been a regular visitor to his farm, raising even more red flags. However, despite the connections between these women and the pattern of killings linked to Van Eyck, the police were never able to conclusively tie him to their deaths. There was speculation that Willem had been responsible for far more deaths than he had confessed to, but the evidence remained elusive. Investigators dug through old cases, re-examining every detail, trying to find a piece of evidence that would link him to these missing women. DNA testing was done, and his property was searched thoroughly. His house was even demolished to check if he buried anything, but despite all their efforts, the authorities were unable to connect Van Eyck to the murders of Antoinette, Shirley, or Yolanda. When Willem Van Eyck's trial finally began in 2002, it quickly became one of the most sensational courtroom dramas in Dutch history. The case had gripped the nation, and as the details of his brutal crimes came to light, the courtroom was filled with both outraged spectators and shocked family members of the victims. The defense and prosecution squared off, but the focus remained squarely on Willem Van Eyck, the man who had committed such unspeakable acts, and the man whose cold demeanor gave no indication of any remorse for his actions. In the courtroom, the prosecution did everything they could to lay bare the full extent of Willem's violent nature. They painted a portrait of a man who had not only murdered women, but had also their bodies in an effort to gain control over them. The testimonies from the victims' families, from psychiatrists, and from law enforcement officers revealed a man whose evil went beyond the mere act of murder. It was the brutality with which he killed, and the total lack of empathy he displayed. The details were so disturbing that some of the courtroom staff were even reported to have vomited upon hearing the specifics of his crimes. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that Van Eyck had no intention of showing any remorse or sympathy for his victims. His explanation for his actions was simple and detached, as though the women he killed were nothing more than tools to satisfy his twisted desires. The defense tried to argue that his violent actions had been the result of his troubled past, of the childhood trauma and mental illness that had been diagnosed during his time in prison. But none of that mattered in the end. The brutality of his crimes could not be explained away by mental illness or past trauma. In the end, on November 7, 2002, Willem Van Eyck was sentenced to life imprisonment for his 3 confirmed murders. It was a verdict that would bring some semblance of closure to the families of the victims, but it did little to alleviate the horror that had been brought to light during the trial. However, even as the sentence was handed down, Willem Van Eyck showed no sign of remorse. He appealed his conviction, hoping to reduce his sentence, but his appeal was rejected. The Supreme Court upheld the ruling, affirming that his crimes were too heinous for any leniency, and this rejection of his appeal was a final affirmation that there would be no escape from the justice he had long avoided. Despite his cold, calculated actions, Willem never truly accepted the consequences of his deeds, even as the system attempted to impose them on him. He continued to request clemency from the Dutch authorities, hoping that he might somehow find a way to gain his freedom, but each time, his requests were denied. Willem Van Eyck's life behind bars was as troubled and chaotic as his life on the outside had been. Despite his conviction and the years he spent in prison, he never fully accepted the consequences of his actions. His time in various prisons was marked by continued problems with authorities, his inability to control his violent tendencies, and his constant attempts to manipulate the system. Van Eyck's refusal to comply with prison rules made him a difficult and dangerous inmate. He would frequently clash with prison guards and staff, often finding himself involved in physical altercations that resulted in multiple transfers from one facility to another. So, in 2016, Van Eyck was transferred to a new facility, this time due to serious behavioral problems that had escalated to the point where his continued stay at his previous institution became untenable. Then, on June 19, 2019, Willem Van Eyck, the man who had once terrorized the streets of South Holland, whose name had become synonymous with cruelty and terror, died in prison. The cause of his death was never publicly revealed, leaving many to wonder about the final chapter of his twisted life. The authorities refused to disclose any further details, but one thing remained clear: his death marked the end of a man whose crimes had haunted the country for decades. Willem van Eyck's legacy is one of terror, manipulation, and a profound sense of evil that went unchecked for decades. His story serves as a chilling reminder that monsters often walk among us, hidden in plain sight until it's too late to stop them. For the people of South Holland, the Beast of Harksteed will forever be a symbol of the evil that can thrive in the most unsuspecting places. And now that you've heard the full story, we'd like to hear your thoughts on this case, so feel free to share them in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. She pushed the car door open even before the car came to a full stop. Her hands were shaking as she moved toward the hospital entrance with the kind of fear that makes a person forget everything except the urge to survive. Staff members near the glass doors saw her coming, stumbling forward with her palm pressed against her chest, trying to hold in the pain long enough to reach safety. And the only words that escaped her were a strained, trembling whisper, "Help, he's coming." A few seconds later, security cameras picked up the slow roll of a car pulling into the lot. The driver stepped out, scanning the area with the steady focus of someone looking for the person who had slipped away. From the window, staff assumed they were watching the end of a domestic dispute, the kind that suddenly explodes into violence. But that assumption would turn out to be wrong, very wrong. Because the man searching for her wasn't her boyfriend. He wasn't a partner she lived with. He wasn't even someone she had chosen to be near. He was her father, the same man she had been trying to escape for nearly 2 decades. And now, after 19 years of living under his control, she had finally run. But to understand why that single moment mattered, to understand how she reached that parking lot covered in, we have to go back with her to the house she wasn't allowed to leave, to the cameras placed above every doorway, and to the threats that kept her quiet. That's where this story really begins. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Tatiana grew up in Los Angeles, and from the outside, her family looked like any other household trying to make ends meet. Her mother worked long hours, often overnight, because she worked as a nanny, cleaned houses, and took whatever jobs she could find. And that meant she was rarely home when the sun went down. Her father, Lindolfo, was the one people noticed first because he carried himself with confidence, and he had the kind of personality that made strangers assume he was disciplined and responsible. He was a karate instructor, and he made sure everyone knew he was the type of man who read constantly, planned carefully, and believed strongly in being in control of his environment. But what people saw in public was very different from the way he behaved once the door closed behind him. Tatiana later explained that the shift started long before she understood what was happening. She was a child, and she did what children naturally do. She trusted the adults around her, especially the one who was supposed to protect her while her mother worked night after night. Her father began to test boundaries in ways that didn't look like danger at first, and he did it slowly enough that she didn't realize the pattern forming around her. He created moments where it was just the two of them in the house, and he used those moments to shape the rules she lived by. He told her that certain things needed to stay between them, and he framed those secrets as something normal. So she learned to stay quiet even when she didn't understand why she had to. He mixed affection with control, and he blended approval with obedience, so she grew up believing that pleasing him was the only way to stay safe. But the assaults didn't happen in the privacy of their home. Instead, Lindolfo chose the karate studio, a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary of discipline and respect. But it was here, among the mats and training equipment, where the terror unfolded. When her mother leaves, Lindolfo has the house to himself, and that's when he'd take advantage of the situation. He knew no one would be around to stop him, so he took advantage of the time, his power, and his control over her. Tatiana was trapped, living in a world where the person who should have protected her became the one who hurt her the most. She was alone, and in the silence of her home, she was forced to endure the pretending everything was fine to anyone who might ask. But nothing was fine. It was a secret life, one that no one knew about except for Lindolfo, who reveled in his control, and Tatiana, whose childhood was stolen, piece by piece. The SA quickly gave way to a series of total isolation and imprisonment, and Lindolfo systematically turned the family's West Adams home into a terrifying cell. But that was only the beginning. He started feeding Tatiana when she was just 6 years old to ensure her vulnerability. She was introduced to at age 8, and followed when she was 10, solidifying his complete control over her developing mental state. Lindolfo was usually on drugs the majority of the time that he, and this addiction continually fueled his rage. Then, he effectively severed her ties to the outside world. He pulled Tatiana out of school when she reached the 6th grade, and now she was entirely trapped without the chance of rescue or disclosure. She recounted that the SA occurred approximately 10 times a week, which meant it was relentless and inescapable, a non-stop cycle of terror she had no way to break. However, Lindolfo was not satisfied with mere physical imprisonment. He demanded total technological surveillance. He installed surveillance cameras both inside and outside the house, but he did not stop there, demonstrating a profound level of calculated cruelty. He set up motion detectors under her bed, and this prevented her from leaving the bed at all during the night. Tatiana was denied even the most basic human dignity, so she was forced to use a bucket next to the bed whenever she needed to relieve herself because she could not risk moving after hours. She lived in constant terror of him, saying she avoided disturbing him because it felt exactly like waking up the beast. This terrifying environment forced Tatiana into the role of a domestic servant. She said on a day-to-day basis, she had to cook and clean, essentially living as his wife while suffering continuous psychological. By the time Tatiana reached the age of 15, the terror that had plagued her childhood evolved into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. What had once been hidden behind closed doors, the manipulation, now became a relentless, horrifying routine. Lindolfo's control over her grew more twisted with each passing year. He made her lure men into their home, men she didn't know, men who would hurt her, and he'd watch while they forced themselves on her. And if she failed to bring men to the house, the consequences were the beatings became crueler, more frequent, and harder to endure. He used whatever he could find, a baseball bat, an extension cord to inflict pain, often targeting her feet and knees. One time, he grabbed her feet and hit them so violently that she couldn't walk for days, the pain leaving her bedridden and unable to even stand. But even in the moments when she could hardly breathe from the pain, the fear of retaliation loomed over her like a shadow. Lindolfo didn't just beat her, he threatened her in ways that made it impossible for her to escape. He threatened to unalive her head, using death as a tool to maintain control over her. Then, as if the wasn't enough, something even more unimaginable happened. She became pregnant, not once, but 3 times, and all 3 of her daughters were fathered by Lindolfo, the man who had destroyed her life in ways no child should ever endure. In the face of such horror, Tatiana learned to survive in the only way she could by retreating into her own mind. She said she used little happy thoughts as her escape, even if it was only for a few moments, to find the strength to keep living through it all. Around 2003, Lindolfo's deep-seated rage finally peaked. He began to fear that Tatiana's younger brother, who was also a victim of Lindolfo's brutal beatings, had talked to the police, so he forced Tatiana and the children to flee immediately. They abandoned Los Angeles and settled in Las Vegas, where they lived in a motel. Lindolfo desperately maintained his public deception there, claiming to anyone who asked that Tatiana was simply his girlfriend. The unstable situation fractured completely in April 2005. Lindolfo had been heavily using drugs. He was extremely high on after days without sleep or food, and this drug-fueled state dissolved his grip on reality. He grew intensely paranoid, becoming violently certain that Tatiana was actively trying to kill him, specifically believing she was somehow sticking a needle into his lung. Tatiana realized this delusion was the only chance for her survival. She bravely convinced him they needed to drive to the hospital, strategically feeding into his fear that he was dying. But he kept a 10-inch kitchen knife firmly gripped in his hand the entire way there. Then, as they reached the hospital parking lot, Lindolfo drove erratically, circling repeatedly. Tatiana saw her opportunity and tried to jump out of the moving car, realizing she had to risk everything for freedom, but she was moments too slow. Lindolfo managed to reach her just as she tried to escape, and he stabbed her twice in the chest with devastating force. Despite the blow, she somehow found the strength to run blindly through the chaos of the lot. The immediate medical assessment was shocking. The knife wound had missed her heart by only 1 centimeter. This attack, which was meant to silence her forever, ironically became the catalyst for her escape and the final necessary breaking of her silence. In the immediate aftermath of the brutal stabbing, Tatiana was consumed by one overriding fear: the safety of her daughters. Even while severely injured in the hospital, she made a difficult, deliberate choice to lie to the police. She claimed her boyfriend did this because she knew she could not risk her children being left alone with the man who had just tried to kill her. However, after the critical surgery, her mind cleared and her resolve solidified. She understood that her chance for permanent freedom had finally arrived, so she summoned the strength to tell the truth. She confessed that the children were, in fact, her father's, and then made her final, definitive declaration that closed the door on 2 decades of terror. "I'm not going back to Dad." Hearing that Lindolfo was officially in custody brought an immense, tangible release from a lifetime of relentless psychological and physical torture. She later described that moment as her born-again day, because it was the day she realized she was finally, undeniably free. The investigation into the hidden life of Lindolfo Tibas then began in earnest. Torrance police detective took over the case, and the detective in charge said in his extensive experience, Lindolfo was probably the sickest suspect he ever had, and he described the trauma Tatiana endured as an unbelievable torture and horrendous acts. The investigation moved quickly to secure undeniable scientific proof, and DNA tests confirmed the incest beyond any doubt, definitively proving Lindolfo was both the father and grandfather of the 3 girls. This genetic evidence was solid, and the indictment for a lifetime of was absolute. The state of California was now ready to bring justice for Tatiana. The state had their evidence, and the case against Lindolfo Tibas moved to trial in 2009. The prosecution then prepared a powerful case, documenting the years of isolation, the distinct physical injury patterns from the beatings, the existence of the complex surveillance systems in their home, and crucial witness statements about his volatility. Then the courtroom drama began. Lindolfo chose to represent himself, and this immediately devolved the legal proceedings into bizarre, tense theater. He behaved extremely delusioned, speaking frequently in the third person, and he furiously accused Tatiana of lying throughout his testimony, suggesting vast, shadowy conspiracies were working against him. Lindolfo even claimed the entire trial was a kangaroo court, arguing his conviction was the result of fraudulent evidence and perjured testimony. However, the jury was not swayed by his bizarre performance. They quickly convicted him on multiple counts of SA, assault, coercion, and inflicting severe bodily injury. The prosecutor then argued fiercely for the maximum possible penalty. He told the court and the public that Lindolfo's crime was compounded because it was done by someone society expected to be a protector, not a predator. Lindolfo tried one final legal maneuver, claiming he had been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Judge Dennis J. Landon immediately rejected these claims, however, dismissing them as a fabrication designed to delay the inevitable sentencing. So, on April 17, 2009, Lindolfo Tibas was sentenced to 109 years to life in prison. As Lindolfo was finally led away in handcuffs, Tatiana wept. Her final statement was delivered with cold certainty, providing a powerful sense of closure. She said she wants him to die in jail because that's what he did to her. He confined her. Tatiana was determined to rebuild her life, to somehow find a way to heal from the scars that had haunted her for so long. She tried to start over as best as she could. She entered new relationships, hoping that maybe she could create a sense of normalcy, a life free from the shadows of her past. She focused on taking care of her children, pouring all her love and energy into them, hoping to shield them from the same pain she had endured. She wanted to be the mother they deserved, a mother who was present and whole. But despite her efforts, healing was not something that could be rushed. She attempted therapy, hoping it would help her unravel the tangled web of emotions and memories that had taken root in her mind. However, the process proved to be emotionally overwhelming, each session pulling at the threads of her past in ways she wasn't prepared for. The weight of her trauma was so heavy, and no matter how hard she tried, the pieces never seemed to fit back together. The emotions that therapy stirred were raw, painful, and often too much to bear, and so she would take a step back, unsure if she was ready to confront what lay beneath the surface. And then, something happened that brought it all rushing back. When her oldest daughter reached the same school grade that Tatiana herself had been in when began, the flashbacks started. They were sudden, uninvited, and relentless. As her daughter navigated the same milestones that Tatiana once had, memories flooded her mind. It was as if the echoes of her childhood were now reverberating through her own daughter's life, and the weight of those memories became almost unbearable. Every moment, every interaction with her daughter seemed to trigger a new wave of memories, pulling Tatiana further into the past, dragging her back to a place she had desperately tried to escape. The healing process, once so hopeful, now felt like a distant dream, and the struggle to find peace seemed even harder than before. The psychological toll was immense, and Tatiana's history of being dominated by men left her dangerously vulnerable. She soon entered a new, destructive relationship with a man who was an active gang member, and he quickly began to manipulate her. She later described this man as violent and controlling, but the trauma of her childhood meant she lacked the ability to say no, even to a controlling partner. He pressured her into criminal activities. First, she was forced into knocking on doors to ensure houses were empty, and then she progressed to acting as a lookout during break-ins. This escalating involvement was a terrifying echo of the control she endured under her father. Tatiana became the driver during one of these burglaries, but the crime went out of control. A police pursuit began, and it eventually ended in a crash. Tatiana was arrested at the scene, and now, just 4.5 years after her father's sentencing, she found herself trapped in the legal system again. She was later convicted of residential burglary and attempted burglary alongside the 3 gang members. The woman who had fought so hard for freedom was now fighting to avoid becoming a prisoner once more. Tatiana stood before the court facing the devastating consequences of her conviction as she faced a maximum prison sentence of more than 12 years, and the state threatened the permanent loss of her 5 children. Furthermore, because of her immigration status, she still lived under the shadow of deportation, and this was the moment where her horrific past directly collided with her criminal present. However, her attorneys argued powerfully for leniency, focusing intensely on her history of severe, lifelong trauma. Ron Siebold, her defense attorney, stated that Lindolfo's decades of meant Tatiana literally doesn't know how to say no to controlling men. The prosecutor acknowledged the unique circumstances, agreeing that she had been manipulated her entire life, and he made an extremely rare exception for leniency, arguing that if anyone deserves it, it's her. The judge ultimately sided with rehabilitation over punishment. She gave Tatiana a remarkably short sentence and awarded her credit for time served while she was awaiting trial. Most critically, the judge ordered her immediate placement into a rehabilitation center and mental health counseling. Tatiana left the courthouse a free woman once again, tearfully thanking the judge and promising to stay out of trouble, and she was soon reunited with her children. Tatiana had secured her freedom, but the fight for her peace had just begun. Looking back on the 2 decades of trauma and the subsequent struggles with the law, she offered a profound reflection on her journey. Her whole life felt stolen, but she had survived and was still surviving. This resilience became her final defining purpose, and she committed herself fully to therapy, recognizing that her mental health was the last piece of the prison she needed to dismantle. She dedicated her life to rebuilding, carefully creating the stable, loving home she never had, and she tirelessly focused on protecting her children from the generational pain Lindolfo inflicted. Then, turning her nightmare into a source of strength, she began speaking out for others, using her voice to shine a light on the she endured. Tatiana was finally in control of her own story. She escaped the man who stole her childhood, and the day she nearly died became the very moment she finally lived. We'd like to hear your thoughts on this case. What responsibilities do we, as a community, have to support survivors like Tatiana as they navigate freedom after a lifetime of confinement? Feel free to share your perspective in the comments below. Conversations like this help shine a light on the long, difficult road to healing. And today, we want to specially thank all our subscribers and the entire tribe. We love you. If you've not subscribed, kindly do that, and see you in the next case.
She was there to tend to her grandmother's grave, and it is actually believed to have been kneeling in front of her grandmother's plot, praying when Dupas struck from behind, stabbing her more than 30 times. This is one of 3 murders that Dupas has now been convicted of. He's also a suspect in another 3 murders. A judge once described Dupas as a psychopath driven by a hatred of women. His history of rapes and other violent assaults on women date back almost 40 years.
Peter Dupas harbored a darkness so monstrous it would shake Australia to its core. For years, he lived unnoticed among people, walking through life like any other until his crimes began to unfold. Over the course of 3 decades, Peter Dupa started small with a twisted obsession over women, which began as a mere fascination, which soon escalated into something far more horrifying. In 1999, Peter's transformation reached its peak when he brutally murdered Nicole Patterson, a psychotherapist he stalked for weeks. Peter Dupas, once a boy next door, would soon be known as one of the most notorious serial killers Australia has ever seen. But the real question is this: how did he get away with it for so long? And how did this boy next door slip through the cracks, leaving behind a trail of terror and heartbreak? As we uncover the disturbing events, the unseen clues, and the crimes that weren't his first, you'll realize just how terrifyingly close we were to the true monster hiding in plain sight. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Nicole Patterson was a 28-year-old psychotherapist living in Melbourne, Australia. She was compassionate, kind-hearted, and deeply committed to helping others. Nicole had always felt a calling to make a difference in people's lives, especially for those struggling with emotional and psychological issues. Growing up, her mother and her family described her as someone with a natural ability to empathize, and they were incredibly proud of her. By her late 20s, Nicole had established herself as a dedicated professional, earning her place in the psychotherapy community. She had a dream of starting her own practice, offering a safe, private space for clients to open up about their challenges. So, to make this dream a reality, Nicole placed an advertisement in a Melbourne newspaper, offering counseling services to those dealing with personal struggles, particularly in their relationships. It was through this ad that Peter Dupas first became aware of Nicole, and when he saw Nicole's ad, something about her intrigued him, and soon he was fixated. Peter, with his history of disturbing behavior, saw an opportunity to exploit this unsuspecting woman, and he began to stalk her. His first step was simple: phone calls. He pretended to be someone in need of therapy, just another person seeking help. But what he was really doing was learning about her routine, figuring out when she would be at home and when she would be most vulnerable. And on April 19, 1999, Peter, under the false name of Malcolm, showed up at Nicole's door, posing as a new client for a counseling session. Nicole, trusting in her profession and her desire to help others, welcomed him into her home, completely unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. But before Peter Dupas met Nicole, before he became a serial killer, he was just a boy, one who had once been part of a seemingly ordinary family. Peter Dupas was born on July 3, 1953 in the city of Sydney, Australia. His parents, though not outwardly, set the foundation for his later path in unsettling ways. As a child, Peter's family moved to Victoria, settling in a quiet suburban area that promised a peaceful, middle-class life. But behind the closed doors was a different reality. Peter's mother, though undoubtedly affectionate, had a deep, overprotective love for her youngest son. Her adoration placed Peter on a pedestal, elevating him beyond the reality of the world around him. She showered him with affection, perhaps too much, shielding him from the real struggles that every child must face. On the other hand, Peter's father, Norris, was a strict man who believed in the value of hard work, perfection, and discipline. However, Peter struggled at school because he stood out in ways that made him a target. His classmates, seeing him as weak and different, quickly began to bully him. He wasn't athletic, and his physical appearance made him an easy target. They teased him for his size, his appearance, and his reserved nature, and Peter, once promising academically, began to fade into the background. However, beneath the surface of this emotionally isolated young man, his frustrations, coupled with his growing sense of alienation, started to twist into something far more evil. The year was 1968, and Peter Dupas, now 15 years old, was about to take the first terrifying step into a world of violence, and it all started with an innocent request for a knife. Peter had gone to the home of a young mother who lived nearby, claiming that the knife they had at home had broken and he needed to borrow her knife. To the woman, it seemed harmless, and she didn't think twice as she stepped inside to fetch him a kitchen knife. As she handed him the knife, and with the blade now in his grasp, he quickly turned on her. In a flash, he lunged at her with the knife, and at that point, Peter had no regard for her life. The woman tried to defend herself, her hands desperately grappling with the knife, but the force of Peter's attack left her injured. Her hands were cut and as she fought to keep the blade away from her body, but she couldn't stop him. And as the woman begged for him to stop, Peter muttered under his breath, "I need to finish this." His words, cold and unfeeling, sent a shiver down her spine. They were a clear indication of what was happening in Peter's mind. It was a growing hunger for violence, a need to assert control and power. Eventually, the woman managed to escape. She fought him off long enough for him to relent, her injuries grave but not fatal. And as he fled the scene, the terror of the moment left her shaken, and the community would later realize that they had just witnessed the first glimpse of a monster lurking in plain sight. For Peter, this was the first taste of violence, and it would leave a mark on him. The feeling of power he had gained in that moment and the control over someone else's life was intoxicating. After Peter's brutal attack on his neighbor, he was arrested for harassing the woman. His actions were severe enough to warrant psychiatric intervention, and he was sent to the Lorraine Psychiatric Hospital for observation. However, this would not be the turning point the authorities had hoped for. Rather than facing the consequences of his violent outburst, Peter found an opportunity to manipulate the system to his advantage. The psychiatric staff, eager to see progress and believing in the potential for rehabilitation, saw Peter as a model patient. He was cooperative, calm, and seemingly remorseful, the perfect portrayal of someone who was ready to change. But for Peter, this was just another game. He had quickly learned how to deceive those around him. To him, the hospital was not a place of punishment, but rather a temporary escape from the consequences of his actions. His behavior, although manipulative, was convincing enough to earn him an early release. He was released just 2 weeks into his stay, and was on 8 months probation while being treated as an outpatient. And just like that, Peter Dupas was back out in the world, not a changed man, but a man who had only refined his ability to lie, deceive, and blend into the fabric of society, all while plotting his next move. By 1973, at the age of 21, Peter's violent impulses had grown stronger, and he had begun to act on his most evil urges. This time, he didn't just attack, he The incident began like so many others. In his mind, a harmless excuse, a way to gain access to a vulnerable woman. Peter knocked on the door of a woman's home, claiming that his car had broken down and asked for a screwdriver. The woman, trusting in the decency of a stranger, led him inside while she fetched it for him, but as soon as she turned her back, Peter forced his way into her home, her, and fled the scene. She was left shaken and traumatized. This pattern of preying on vulnerable women, using harmless excuses to gain entry before turning violent quickly, became Peter's mode of operation. Peter would approach his victims with an innocent excuse, a broken-down car, a need for a phone, only to reveal his true nature once he gained access. His first conviction came soon after, when he was arrested for the and at trial, Peter was found guilty and sentenced to 9 years in prison. Despite his violent history, he managed to manipulate his way through psychiatric evaluations, convincing professionals that he was no longer a threat. In 1979, after serving just 5 years of his 9-year sentence, Peter was released on parole. The system had failed to see through his guise, and within months of his release, Peter's violent urges were once again unleashed. In 1980, Peter was arrested again, this time for another SA. He had targeted a woman at random, using the same deceptive tactics he had used in the past. He was convicted once more and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. By 1985, Peter had been released again, this time after serving just 7 years of his second sentence. This was a decision that would later haunt the society, as Peter was soon back to his predatory ways. In the early 1980s, after his release, he stalked more women, committing acts of violence and assault. Again, he was convicted of another brutal assault by 1985, and this time, the sentencing was more severe. Peter was sentenced to 12 years for aggravated SA, and the system appeared to take a firmer stance. But even in prison, Peter's charm did not wane. He formed a relationship with a nurse, Grace, who was 16 years older than him, and they got married in 1987, while he was still incarcerated. Peter's time in prison was, however, relatively short. In 1992, after serving just 7 years of his 12-year sentence, Peter was released once again. And for a period of 2 years, Peter and his wife, Claire, lived what seemed to be a normal life, but this would soon change. By 1994, Peter was back to stalking women, this time attacking one at a public toilet at Melbourne Park, while she was out camping with her friends. Peter approached the woman, claiming that he needed to use the toilet facilities. But once inside, he lunged at her, intent on subduing and attacking her. The woman, however, fought back fiercely, managing to escape Peter's grasp, and in a desperate attempt to flee, she screamed for help, and Peter, realizing his plan was falling apart, quickly retreated. The police caught up with him. The items that were later found in Peter's possession told a disturbing story. Balaclavas, handcuffs, and other items used for restraint and control were discovered, revealing his intentions. A sickening reminder that Peter's desire for control and violence was far from over. However, Peter was only convicted for attempted SA and his sentencing was relatively light. He received a sentence of 3 years and 9 months with a minimum term of 2 years and 9 months. Grace, who had once believed he was reformed, could no longer ignore the darkness within him. And in 1996, after he was released from prison, Claire finally reached a breaking point and filed for divorce. The years of emotional manipulation, combined with his criminal history, had taken a toll on their relationship, and she no longer felt safe or supported. And by the time he was released from this sentence in September 1996, he had spent 20 years in jail for sexual offenses. Peter Dupas had always been a man who operated in the shadows, and by April 1999, his dark desires had led him to target Nicole Patterson. On the morning of April 19, 1999, Peter arrived at Nicole's home under the guise of a simple counseling session. Nicole, who was known for her warm and empathetic nature, welcomed him into her home, offering him coffee as they sat down to talk. Little did she know, she was about to become the victim of one of the most brutal and horrific crimes in Australian history. The session, however, was just a means for him to gain access to her. As soon as Peter was inside, his true intentions became horrifyingly clear. Without warning, he attacked Nicole. He struck her repeatedly with a brutal force that seemed to come from some place deep within him. Nicole fought back fiercely, her instincts kicking in as she tried to escape, but Peter's rage was overwhelming. He stabbed her 27 times in a frenzy of violence, each blow more savage than the last. But that wasn't enough for Peter. Once he had rendered her helpless, he began her body. Nicole's breasts were in a disturbing act. It was like a sickening attempt to leave his mark on his victim. In Peter's mind, this wasn't just about murder, it was about control, dominance, and deriving satisfaction from the suffering of another human being. After the attack, Peter didn't simply leave the scene in haste. He stayed for a moment longer, taking steps to cover his tracks. He attempted to clean the apartment, erasing any evidence that might link him to the crime. However, the darkness within him was impossible to hide. It didn't take long for the police to begin their investigation, and Peter's arrogance became his downfall. The police, working quickly, were able to track Nicole's phone records, and they discovered that Peter had used his own phone to contact Nicole repeatedly before the attack, tracing his movements back to his home. When investigators searched his property, they found a collection of disturbing evidence: a piece of paper with Nicole's name and appointment details, a pair of gloves, a balaclava, condoms, and even a newspaper article about Nicole's murder. It was all the proof the authorities needed to make an arrest. Peter was taken into custody, and despite his efforts to deny any involvement, the evidence against him was irrefutable. Despite his desperate attempts to cover his tracks, the evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA samples found on the clothes Peter had discarded confirmed his involvement, cementing the case as virtually open and shut. In the courtroom, Peter was cold and emotionless. It was clear that he felt no remorse for his actions, no hint of guilt or compassion for the life he had taken. As the trial unfolded, the families of Peter's victims, especially Nicole's family, were forced to confront the horrific reality of the evil. For them, it wasn't just a court case. It was a painful reminder of the unspeakable loss and the terror that Peter had brought into their lives. Peter was then sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, The judge stated that this was the only punishment fitting for a man whose crimes carried such gravity. The police began to piece together his pattern of violence, and they soon linked him to other brutal killings that had once seemed unrelated and unsolved. One of the most notable cases was a street worker, Margaret Ma, whose murder in 1997 mirrored the horrifying details of Nicole Patterson's death. Margaret's body had been in a disturbingly similar way, her breast a clear indication that Peter's signature was at work once again. The similarities were not just coincidental. DNA evidence from the crime scenes was carefully cross-referenced, and it didn't take long for investigators to confirm the truth. Peter Dupas was connected to these unsolved murder. His dark signature of his victims' bodies was unmistakable. It became clear that Peter was not just a random killer, but a serial murderer. Mersina Halvagas was another victim whose tragic death was linked to Peter Dupas. On November 1st, 1997, Mersina, a 25-year-old bank officer, was brutally attacked and murdered while visiting her grandmother's grave at a cemetery in Melbourne. She had been placing flowers on the grave when Peter struck. Her body was found later that day, lying face up between the headstones, just a short distance from where she had been praying. Similar to his other victims, her body was mutilated, with repeated wounds over 87 times, especially to her breasts, a pattern that had become Peter's signature. At first, her murder remained unsolved, but as investigators began to piece together the evidence, they discovered disturbing links to Peter. So, in 2002, a fellow inmate of Peter's revealed that Peter had confessed to the murder during a conversation. The inmate recalled how Peter had repeatedly mentioned Mersina's name and had described the crime in gruesome detail. This revelation eventually led to a new trial, and in 2007, Peter was found guilty of Mersina Halvagas' murder.
Notorious serial killer Peter Dupas has received a third life sentence for the stabbing murder of Mersina Halvagas in Melbourne 13 years ago. Earlier this month, Dupas was convicted of the 25-year-old's killing for the second time. The Halvagas family is now hoping they can finally move on.
The Halvagas family's 13-year quest for justice has taken its toll. They're now determined to put Peter Dupas behind them.
He's really irrelevant to our life now.
I'd like to thank everybody, and I pray to God that I will never ever have another one like these.
Peter Norris Dupas stood unflinching as Justice Elizabeth Hollingworth told him that the fact he's already serving life without parole didn't change the need to publicly denounce his terrible crime. During a retrial earlier this month, the jury again convicted the 57-year-old of stabbing Miss Halvagas more than 30 times as she tended her grandmother's grave at Fawkner Cemetery in 1997. Dupas is a serial rapist with convictions dating back to 1974. He murdered Nicole Patterson and Margaret Ma in a similar brutal fashion. Both women's bodies were mutilated. Justice Hollingworth described Dupas's attack on Mersina Halvagas as savage and ferocious. Trying to explain his actions, Justice Hollingworth stated that Dupas seemed to be motivated by a deeply entrenched, perverted and sadistic hatred of women and a complete contempt for them and their right to live.
Justice Hollingworth remarked that Dupas was probably looking for a vulnerable target at Fawkner Cemetery and that tragically it seemed Miss Halvagas was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time.
She was doing the right thing at the right time. It was that inferior coward that was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Dupas remains a suspect in 3 unsolved murders during the 80s and 90s. James Bennett, ABC News, Melbourne.
He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the crime, adding another chapter to his growing list of victims.
Victorian serial killer Peter Dupas is about to be sentenced over an horrific murder, bringing to an end one family's 13-year quest for justice. 10's Christopher Still is at court in Melbourne. Chris, tell us the story here. Who exactly did Dupas murder?
Well, Ron, Peter Dupas murdered 25-year-old Mersina Halvagas at Melbourne's Fawkner Cemetery 13 years ago. She was there to tend to her grandmother's grave and is actually believed to have been kneeling in front of her grandmother's plot praying when Dupas struck from behind, stabbing her more than 30 times. This is one of 3 murders that Dupas has now been convicted of. He's also a suspect in another 3 murders. A judge once described Dupas as a psychopath driven by a hatred of women. His history of rapes and other violent assaults on women date back almost 40 years.
Christopher, what's the maximum sentence or even the likely sentence that he'll face today?
Well, Ron, this is one of those rare cases in the courts where we actually can be fairly certain of the sentence Dupas will receive. He's already serving 2 life sentences without any chance of parole over the other 2 murders he's already been convicted of carrying out. He's expected to receive a 3rd today. In many ways, today isn't really even about Peter Dupas, it's about the Helvargas family and giving them the chance to see the man who cruelly snatched away the life of a much-loved daughter and sister finally punished for his crime.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. Court reporter Christopher Still in Melbourne.
Also among the many unsolved murders in Peter Dupas's wake is the murder of 95-year-old Kathleen Downs, who was found murdered in her room at a Brunswick nursing home. On New Year's Eve, 1997, the elderly woman had been in the neck and her body left in a state of horror. At the time, her death appeared to be yet another tragic, unexplained loss among the elderly. However, as investigators revisited the case years later, they began to link it to Peter Dupas. Evidence surfaced that Peter had made a series of calls to the nursing home under a false name prior to her death, raising suspicions. Also, Renee Brunton, a 31-year-old woman, was found murdered in the rear of her workplace, a recycling shop. She had been 106 times, with particular focus on her breasts and thighs. Also, the nature of the attack was all too familiar, mirroring the crimes of Peter Dupas, and as investigators connected the dots, Peter's name emerged as a suspect, but there was not enough evidence to convict him. While this murder remains officially unsolved, police believe that Peter's signature cruelty, the senseless violence, and the hidden nature of his attacks was present. Once again, Kathleen Diaz's death would add to the growing list of his brutal crimes, one more shadow on the long trail of terror he left behind. Police remained convinced that Peter was responsible for other unsolved murders, with several still marked as unresolved on the books. His signature, the of his victims' bodies, particularly their breasts, seemed to follow him from one crime scene to the next, leading many to believe there were more victims out there. Peter Dupas, now behind bars, would remain there for the rest of his life. Even from within the confines of his prison cell, Peter's legacy would continue to haunt the survivors, the families, and all those who had crossed his path. His name would forever be etched into Australia's criminal history, a reminder of the darkness that can hide beneath the surface of an ordinary life. Now we'd like to hear from you. What do you think about Peter Dupas's crimes and the legacy he left behind? Do you believe there could be more victims? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. Nurses rushed a small stretcher toward the trauma bay while a doctor called out vitals, and the only thing anyone knew for certain was that the child they were fighting for was just 2 years old. The doctors could see developing across the toddler's torso, and one of the nurses whispered that the child's abdomen felt too swollen for it to be something simple. So while the medical staff tried to stabilize her, the questions began forming just as quickly. Why hadn't anyone called 911 sooner? How long had she been unresponsive? And what exactly had happened inside the camper where she was last seen alive? But the detectives knew they had to start with the only adult who had been with the child that morning. And that was how, hours later, Travis Ray Thompson ended up sitting in a small interrogation room, with his hands shaking slightly as he tried to explain a story that detectives already knew didn't make sense. The detective across from him leaned forward, watching his face closely, and repeated a fact the hospital had delivered without hesitation. Her spine was broken. But Travis shouted back, "That's not something I could inflict on a child." But by then, the investigators already had more than doubts. They had a timeline filled with holes and a medical report that pointed in only one direction. But this case is far from simple because what investigators would discover next would shock the entire community. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Before her name appeared in headlines and court records, Jacqueline Schwingel had simply been a lively 2-year-old who filled her small world with noise and curiosity. Her mother, Kristen, often said she moved through the day like she didn't want to miss a single thing, and the people who knew her remembered the way she laughed when she ran, or how she carried her stuffed toys around like they were friends she needed to check on from time to time. She was a toddler who deserved an ordinary childhood, and the kindness of that image made the details that followed even more difficult to accept. And while Jacqueline's life was bright, the dynamic around her had grown tense in the weeks before her death. Kristen and Travis Ray Thompson had ended their relationship not long before May 2022, and the breakup didn't settle quietly. They still shared space because Travis had been living in her camper, and he didn't have anywhere else to go, so being around Kristen was the only stability he had left. But the relationship had changed, and the text messages between them showed that Travis struggled with the shift far more than Kristen did. He depended on her emotionally, and the messages revealed long stretches of pleading, frustration, and fear of being left behind. She tried to create distance, but he kept pulling the line back toward her. So by the morning of May 3rd, 2022, around 7 a.m., Travis got up and began the morning routine he usually handled when Kristen worked early. He woke the older child and helped him get dressed for school. Then Travis walked him to the bus stop and waited with him until the bus arrived, and he climbed aboard while Travis headed back toward the camper. When he got inside, he took out his firearms because he said he planned to clean them. The gun, a loaded AR-style pistol, ended up resting near the futon where Jacqueline usually watched cartoons, and he would later insist the safety was on, and that he kept it there only because he hadn't finished putting it away. Kristen woke not long after and moved through the cramped space quickly because she was already running late for work. A few minutes later, Kristen left for her shift, and Travis stayed outside with Jacqueline. He told detectives that they walked down to the lake for about 15 minutes so she could throw rocks and look at the water. Then they headed back to the camper, and he put her on the futon and turned on Cat Dog, her favorite cartoon. Then Travis said he went into the bathroom. He claimed he was in there for about 10 minutes, and everything during that span of time depended entirely on his version of events, because no one else had been inside the camper. According to him, he heard a loud thud. He opened the bathroom door and saw Jacqueline lying on the floor next to the futon. He said she wasn't responding and that she was making a faint gurgling sound. Her body felt limp when he picked her up, and he told detectives she had peed on herself, which made him realize something serious had happened. He said he panicked and called Kristen first because he didn't know what to do. He said he tried calling 911, but the call didn't go through. That detail would become one of the first major cracks in his story because investigators later pulled his phone records and saw there hadn't been a single attempt to dial emergency services from inside that camper. So while Jacqueline lay limp on the camper floor, Travis told Kristen to come home because something was wrong, and she didn't waste a second. She rushed back toward the campground, and the moment she walked inside the camper, she saw her daughter on the futon, unresponsive, with only a faint, shallow pulse. Her abdomen looked swollen in a way that didn't make sense, and the panic on her face grew as she tried to understand what she was seeing. Kristen dropped down beside her and tried breathing into her mouth while Travis kept saying he didn't know what had happened, and the fear in the room escalated because they still had not contacted emergency services. So they did the only thing they thought they could do at that moment. They picked Jacqueline up together and carried her out to the vehicle. Travis drove while Kristen held her daughter in her arms, and the drive toward the hospital began with both of them hoping she was still alive. But somewhere on that road, Kristen realized Jacqueline wasn't breathing at all anymore, and her panic reached a level that forced Travis to finally do what he should have done the moment he found the toddler on the floor. That was when he finally called 911, 37 minutes after his first call to Kristen. When paramedics arrived, they met them in the parking lot of Old Crow Barbecue, a small restaurant off the main road. The EMS team took Jacqueline from Kristen's arms and immediately began CPR in the back of the ambulance. And even in that chaotic moment, the medics could tell her injuries didn't match the story they'd heard from Travis, but they didn't have time to question it yet. Their only job was to keep her heart moving long enough to get her to the emergency room. At Advent Health Waterman Hospital, the reaction from the medical team was immediate and direct. The first nurse who examined Jacqueline felt her abdomen and exchanged a glance with the attending doctor because the swelling and rigidity were signs of internal bleeding. A toddler simply didn't develop those symptoms from a fall beside a futon. Her heart rate was unstable and her breathing remained shallow and fragile. The doctors made the call to transfer her to Orlando after realizing the internal trauma was too severe for their facility to manage, and Jacqueline was placed on a helicopter while Kristen tried to understand why her daughter's condition had deteriorated so suddenly. But even with the transfer and every effort made, Jacqueline's injuries overwhelmed her small body. She was pronounced dead early that afternoon, and the shock inside the trauma team was matched only by the quiet grief coming from the hallway where Kristen waited. Then came the part that no one wanted to think about, but everyone knew was necessary. The suspicious injuries, the swollen abdomen, the lack of an accident that could explain such trauma. So they contacted the Marion County Sheriff's Office to report a suspected case of, and the early questions about what happened in the camper turned into a full investigation the moment that call went through. And the inconsistencies that were small at first were about to spread into every part of Travis's story. While the hospital team worked through the first chaotic hours of Jacqueline's case, deputies from the Marion County Sheriff's Office drove to the RV campground in Umatilla because they needed to see the place where everything had unfolded. The call from the hospital described injuries that were not consistent with a simple accident, and the deputies understood that the scene inside the camper might hold answers. When they arrived, they knocked on the door several times, waiting for someone to open it, and no one came. So the deputies stepped back and looked around the campground, hoping one of the neighbors had seen or heard something that would help them understand what kind of environment Jacqueline had been living in. A couple from the neighboring campsite walked over when they noticed the patrol car, and the woman immediately asked if everything was all right. The deputy explained that one of the children from the camper had been taken to the hospital and was in very serious condition, and the woman's face froze in a way that told him she had been expecting something terrible to happen long before the deputies arrived. She told them there were 2 children living in that camper, and although she didn't see anything directly that morning, she had noticed troubling things in the weeks before. She said the kids were left outside unsupervised far too often, sometimes wandering around the campground without an adult nearby. But what bothered her more were the arguments she overheard between Kristen and Travis, especially the one she remembered clearly from 2 months earlier. She had been sitting outside when she heard Kristen shout, "Don't touch my kids." The tone had stuck with her because it didn't sound like a simple disagreement about discipline. It sounded like someone reacting to a threat. So she told the deputy everything she remembered, and she said it in a way that made it clear she had been uneasy about the situation long before the sheriff's office ever showed up at her door. Amidst the investigation, the deputies also learned that Travis had been involved in a previous child injury case in 2019, where a young boy suffered a broken arm while in his care. He had described it as an accident, but the pattern of harm surrounding him was growing harder to dismiss. And when investigators compared the timeline he gave at the hospital to the reality shown through phone logs and witness statements, they saw the inconsistencies forming quickly. His bathroom story didn't align with the injury, and his claim about calling 911 didn't match the records. The emotional behavior he displayed in those early encounters felt more like someone trying to protect himself than someone desperate to explain how a toddler suddenly collapsed in his care. By the time deputies finished speaking with the neighbors and securing the scene, they understood that the truth of what happened inside that camper wasn't going to come from Travis's first explanation. The first cracks in his story had already appeared, and every step they took after that widened them. Detectives brought Travis Ray Thompson into an interview room later that afternoon, hours after doctors confirmed that 2-year-old Jacqueline had died. He came in talking casually and trying to appear helpful, as though the death of a child under his care was something he could explain away with cooperation. They then asked him about his relationship with Kristen, Jacqueline's mother. Travis described her as more than a girlfriend, insisting she was the closest person in his life and someone he loved deeply. He painted himself as devoted, selfless, and emotionally supportive, and when detectives asked about Jacqueline, he portrayed her as energetic and outgoing, a toddler who loved attention and often filled the camper with singing. Once he settled into that version of himself, the detectives moved him toward the events of that morning. He recounted the day from the moment he woke up, how he took the older child to the bus stop and returned to the camper. He repeated the same timeline he had given earlier, the short walk to the lake, the return to the camper, the cat-dog episode, and the 10 minutes he claimed he spent in the bathroom. He then described the moment he said everything changed. According to him, he heard a thud from outside the bathroom door, came out, and found Jacqueline lying on the floor. He insisted she was limp, unresponsive, and making a gurgling sound, and he claimed she had lost bladder control and was barely breathing, and that he panicked and tried calling 911, but the call never went through. Instead, he called Kristen and told her to come home. He maintained that he performed CPR until Kristen arrived. As he spoke, the detectives marked several red flags, and his calmness contrasted sharply with the severity of the injury doctors had reported. His claim that he attempted to call 911 didn't match the phone logs they had already pulled earlier in the day. Investigators at the camper had found the loaded AR-style pistol placed right beside the futon where Travis said Jacqueline had been lying, and when questioned about that, he responded that he had taken it out to clean it and hadn't thought its placement mattered. They also asked about a small plastic baggie found inside his wallet, which he dismissed immediately, and said there was nothing harmful in the home that Jacqueline could have ingested. When detectives asked whether he had ever hit the children, he denied it. He said the worst he ever did was give a single pop on the butt before placing them in the corner. Yet neighbors had heard him being confronted by Kristen for touching the kids, and the detectives recognized another inconsistency beginning to form. As the interview continued, they introduced the first hint that the injuries didn't match his version of events. They told him that early medical findings suggested the trauma was not something that happened from a fall from a futon or a minor incident. Travis immediately insisted he would never hurt a child and said he had no reason to harm anyone. But then he added something new. Almost as if he felt he needed to account for a developing detail he sensed the detectives were circling. He said that Jacqueline had occasionally complained that her back hurt or that her throat hurt, and that sometimes she walked around as if her spine was bothering her. None of this had been mentioned earlier in the day, and Kristen had told investigators that Jacqueline had never complained of back pain, yet Travis now added it without being prompted, and the timing of this revelation caught the detectives' attention. They didn't challenge him immediately. Instead, they let him continue. They understood that the part of the body he had chosen to focus on, her back, matched the location of the fatal injury. They also understood that he had no idea how detailed the medical findings were, and that the autopsy scheduled for the next day would confirm something far more violent than any fall could explain. But for now, they stayed silent, letting him offer a story that was already beginning to crack. As the interview went on, the calm Travis tried to maintain began to slip. He shifted in his chair and rubbed his face repeatedly, and when detectives circled back to inconsistencies in his timeline, he suddenly announced that the whole situation felt like a setup. He said it with a defensive edge, as if he believed the investigation existed simply to target him rather than uncover how a 2-year-old child had died. They continued pressing him gently but firmly, because by this point, they already had the early findings from the medical examiner. The conversation then moved toward a polygraph that Kristen had already agreed to take without hesitation. When they asked Travis if he would do the same, he refused immediately, and he insisted the machine was part of the setup he kept warning them about. As his anxiety climbed, detectives also had to consider something beyond the case. They had already seen text messages he sent to Kristen that morning and the night before, and some of those messages hinted at harming himself if things became too overwhelming. They asked him about those texts and heard him admit that he felt hopeless because no one believed him. So the deputies stepped in and informed him that, for his safety, they could not let him leave. They placed him under a Baker Act hold, meaning he would be taken for psychiatric observation. Travis didn't fight the decision. He just simply lowered his head and muttered that everything was falling apart. And when the final autopsy report arrived months later, even Travis would no longer be able to hide behind the bathroom door. By September 1st, 2022, 4 months had passed since the day Jacqueline was brought into the emergency room unresponsive. During that time, investigators waited for the full medical examiner's report, because the preliminary findings had already suggested something far more violent than a fall from a futon. But when the final autopsy was completed, the case shifted instantly from suspicion to certainty. The report detailed traumatic injuries to Jacqueline's torso, and the most devastating finding was the complete disarticulation of her lumbar spine, meaning the spine had been separated in a way that medical examiners almost never saw outside of catastrophic high-force trauma. The injury had caused massive internal bleeding behind her abdomen, and the examiner concluded that the only possible explanation was the application of significant, gradual force that bent the child backward over a fulcrum, something solid positioned under her lower back while her upper and lower body were pushed in opposite directions. The force needed to cause this break wasn't sudden and it wasn't accidental. It required control, pressure, and time. The medical examiner explained that Jacqueline would have lost consciousness immediately, and the pain would have been so overwhelming that she would not have been able to cry out. It also could not have been caused by anyone other than the person who was with her during those minutes in the camper, and there was only one adult inside that camper. When detectives brought Travis back in after the full medical examiner's report arrived, the tone of the room shifted immediately. They no longer circled around possibilities or hinted at inconsistencies. They began with the one detail that wiped out every version of his story. They told him the truth plainly, and their voices were calm. Her spine is completely separated. He stared at them, blinking slowly, as if the words were too heavy to settle. They continued, telling him the medical examiner had ruled the death a homicide and that nothing about the injury suggested an accident. But he didn't respond with grief or shock. Instead, he began searching for explanations that might shift the blame far from him. He suggested that hospital staff might have mishandled Jacqueline, and he insisted they should have considered whether an unseen nurse had lifted her the wrong way. But detectives reminded him that the injury was what caused her collapse, not something that appeared later. When that theory failed, he shifted again, arguing the injury might have been old or something that had finally caught up with her. And when that angle fell apart, he tried another, insisting that CPR could have snapped her spine. Detectives calmly explained that CPR could not produce that type of injury, and that the break required force, leverage, and control, 3 things that lined up perfectly with the time he had been alone with her. With every theory he floated, detectives produced evidence that dismantled it. Then detectives introduced the piece they had been saving, the motive they believed could explain Travis's spiraling emotional state leading up to that morning. They pulled out his text messages from the days before Jacqueline's death and read them aloud, laying out a pattern of desperation and unraveling self-control. The messages showed him begging Kristen to come back, accusing her of abandoning him, demanding answers, and flooding her phone with calls. They showed searches he made late at night about how to fix a breakup and how to get an ex-girlfriend to return. The timeline showed all of this happening in the 24 hours before Jacqueline died. Detectives laid the messages on the table and told him plainly that emotional distress often escalated into violence, especially when someone felt rejected, trapped, or replaced. And when they told him the charge was first-degree homicide, he was shocked. Then they added that the case met criteria that made the death penalty a possibility in Florida. The room fell silent and Travis dropped his voice to a whisper. "I don't want to die." The detectives waited, hoping he would finally explain what happened in those minutes alone with Jacqueline, but he didn't. He kept insisting that he didn't know, repeating the same line he had used since the first day, even though the evidence contradicted every word. With no explanation offered and no new information to evaluate, the interrogation ended. That evening, Travis Ray Thompson was booked into the Marion County Jail. The charge was formalized the first-degree murder in the death of 2-year-old Jacqueline Schwingle. And for the first time since May 3rd, the case began moving toward the courtroom where every piece of evidence would finally be laid bare. By the time Travis sat in a courtroom in 2025, nearly 3 years had passed since Jacqueline's death, and prosecutors had built a case that left almost no room for interpretation. Assistant State Attorneys Amy Berndt and Sasha Kidney spent that time assembling every medical report, every interrogation transcript, every piece of phone metadata, and every witness statement that showed the same truth playing out from different angles. They leaned heavily on the medical evidence because it was precise and unemotional, and they used the timeline because it exposed the gaps in Travis's story. They also revisited the prior child injury case from 2019 because it demonstrated a pattern that made his explanations in 2022 even harder to believe. When the trial opened in June 2025, the jury heard everything in the order prosecutors felt would be hardest to ignore. They saw the messages to Kristen and how his emotional state shifted from pleading to panicking in the days before Jacqueline died. And they saw the evidence of the 37-minute delay before anyone called for help. A delay that became a turning point once jurors understood how catastrophic Jacqueline's injury had been. The medical examiner's testimony created the clearest picture. Once closing arguments ended, The jury stepped into deliberations, and the speed of their decision reflected the weight of the evidence they had just heard. They took less than 2 hours to return to the courtroom, and the foreperson delivered the verdict without hesitation: guilty of first-degree murder. Sentencing followed quickly. Judge Barbara Kistner reviewed the conviction, the statutory requirements, and the severity of the crime, and then she issued the only sentence the law allowed: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Travis stood silent as the judgment was read, and the courtroom remained still. Public officials responded within hours. State Attorney Bill Gladson released a statement saying, "Life in prison is too good for this kind of evil," a line that captured how deeply the case had disturbed everyone who touched it. Sheriff Billy Woods thanked his detectives and reminded the community that the county would continue to stand between its children and those who harmed them. "In Marion County, we protect our children," he said. And with that sentence, the legal side of Jacqueline's case finally came to a close. After the verdict, Jacqueline's family felt a mix of relief and deep, lasting grief. The conviction brought closure, but it didn't soften the pain of losing a 2-year-old who should have grown up, gone to school, and lived a full life. The community felt the weight of the case too, because the brutality of her injury and the betrayal by someone trusted left many shaken. People struggled with how something so violent could happen inside a familiar camper, in a morning that had seemed completely ordinary. CA experts and state data showed that Jacqueline's case fit a painful reality in Florida, where most confirmed happens within trusted circles. Through all the legal steps and public reactions, one message stayed clear: Jacqueline's life mattered, and the justice system ensured she wouldn't be forgotten. Jacqueline wasn't supposed to die in a camper. She was supposed to grow up. How can we, as a society, do a better job of protecting children when the threat comes from someone close, someone trusted, someone familiar? What systems need to change? What signs should communities pay attention to? And how do we make it easier for people to speak up when something feels wrong, even if they're not completely sure? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.